Hi, I'm really excited to share this week's portrait of Nikola Tesla with you. It certainly was a challenge, but let me show you step by step as to how I came to this. Let's go. Welcome back for another portrait. As promised last week, I am delivering on a portrait of a famous person. This is none other than Nikola Tesla. A lot of you probably know of him. I will get into particulars of his life and why he's so well regarded. If nothing else, you probably recognize his last name from the automaker company. But more on that later on. This week's video is a bit longer than my usual. I like to sort of keep them within 20 minutes or 20 to 30 minutes. This was actually an hour and a half video that I edited down to about 35 minutes. The reason being is that I want to document as much of the process as possible. This video is slightly different. As mentioned, it was a bit of a challenge as I'm working from a black and white reference that you see there on the screen right now. So, as I said, video is a little longer. Techniques that I use are somewhat similar. They overlap with previous content that I've shared here on YouTube, but I've had a lot of questions on the technique and how do I apply this? How do I get the effects for myself from certain subscribers? So that's why this video is a little longer, and also because some of the tools and techniques are new for YouTube, for you guys here. I haven't used some of the things that I will cover later on, so do stick around to find out what they are. I don't have a habit usually of watching my own videos after the fact, but I did watch the last few, and it's an experience, let me tell you, listening to your own self, explaining things. And I promised myself in the future videos I'm not going to speak as much. I'm going to let the technique speak for itself and maybe introduce interesting music as a form, I guess, of some visual therapy. So music, art, what better combination? Anyway, for this particular portrait, as I said, I am doing certain things differently. Of course, as I showed you already, I'm working off of a black and white reference. I'm also doing a lot more brush work. So with regards to all of the content, for the most part, that I've put out here on YouTube since November when I started, obviously a lot of it was educational, introducing certain concepts of good painting and good drawing and so on and so forth. I think this portrait of Nikola Tesla is as close to my actual approach to portrait if I was to be commissioned to do one. Last commission, direct commission of this type, was a couple years back. I don't really have time to take on any for the last little while, certainly because I have my own load of work that I have to get to. But I think this particular portrait has a nice balance of brushwork and silicone work, which you see me there using now. This is the silicone brush that I purchased recently. It's a 2-inch on one side, 1-inch on the other, and having applied the base drawing initially actually was transferred over and reinforced with some dry brush technique. Having done that, I am now coming over with cold wax and oil paint. The cold wax and the paints that I use for this particular portrait are both from Gamblin. I'm used to using their product for this style of work where cold wax is used. There's other suppliers, of course, you can certainly experiment, and I usually in this initial stage go with around a 50-50 ratio. I used the squeegee initially. Now I'm coming in with this, I used the silicone brush, I should say. I'm coming in with this brass squeegee to make interesting marks. If you've at all watched my content here on YouTube and are familiar with my process, it is always I guess you can call it addition and subtraction construction and destruction. So I'm coming in with a squeegee brush just to sort of lay down the foundation, base foundation of cold wax and oil, over which, as you can see in that finished portrait on the right, I come in with, in this case it was probably 2 or 3 layers of lighter color values to add interest to that background. You can already see from this initial stage the color mood that I want set. So this initial underpainting stage, by the way, the initial underpainting was done with acrylic, just correct color, because it dries quickly and it provides just a base warm that I will apply the top coat over. You can already see with this initial subsequent or first stage of oil and cold wax, just sort of an idea as to what direction I want the background to sort of go. It's going to be warm greens, warm yellows. I'm bringing in some darks right now with some cad yellows, and I think it's raw umber there. I'm mixing it with just to sort of give depth to that background. What I'm doing here is essentially just flattening that first oil and cold wax layer, as I don't want it to be too thick. So initially I want it to be relatively lean, relatively thin, so the subsequent layers can be moderately thicker. What you'll also see with this tool that I'm using, the hand squeegee catalyst tool, is the broken color effect it creates. So what I didn't show here is the small amount of Gamsol that I sprayed on that layer just to create that distressed look that I like a lot. Now I'm coming in with the second layer for the background. Again, approximately the same ratio, 50 to 50 with cold wax and oil, indicating some dark accents for the background and also for his clothing. Now, if you recall, I am working from just a headshot, a black and white headshot, which I will talk about in a few minutes. But for the rest of this was a combination of intuition and just me looking at myself in the mirror. The clothing is, as you can see in the finished work, it's not at all rendered. It indicates some sort of formal attire, which he was known to have been photographed in. There's not too many photos of Nikola Tesla that I could have found that I can use as reference. It was important for me, of course, with this portrait to make it spontaneous, to make it very intuitive, but also to get a very much of a likeness. You'll notice with some of these brush marks and silicone marks, a lot of them are, as I said, intuitive in the sense that I'm sort of jumping all over the canvas with it. I'm of course defining form, but a lot of the marks are just sort of instinctual, if you will. They're just sort of, I guess, interesting to me, and they're done somewhat subconsciously. I'm obviously measuring, I'm looking at things and placing things accordingly, but sometimes these things just come out on their own, whether it's a brush, as I said, or whether it's a squeegee tool. With regards to interesting mark making, in this case using a brush, you'll first notice how I'm holding that brush very loosely. Secondly, I want you to note that the paint that I usually have it, in this case it's a flat 3/4 inch. The paint that's on there, it's being applied as a dry brush. I am kind of scumbling, I'm pulling the brush across the features of his eyes to define some sort of details. And that broken color effect can be achieved this way, as opposed to taking a brush and just filling in his eye socket or eyebrows or whatever other feature, which tends to leave like a, I don't know, like a formulaic type look. Now that I'm starting to apply some of the lighter tones, to his face, I thought we addressed this photo reference. So again, as I said, this is Nikola Tesla in his younger years, and it's a common photo. If you Google his name, this will very likely pop up. Now, there are aspects of this photo that I really like. I like the lighting coming in from his right and left in the photo. I like the way that the head is tilted. He is likely seated, although you never know. He's almost entirely turned to his left. I don't necessarily like that contorted look of his head and neck. So what I have him doing is I'm using that reference, of course, to gauge the drawing for his face, but I've got him seated more in a frontal position with, as I said, I'm using my own hand, my own sort of wardrobe as reference for the rest of the body. I am, as I said, referencing his face, hair, and also the collar. I like the way that collar pops out and sort of frames his face. I will use that for the final sort of look. So that will be one of the hardest or the sharpest edges, that white collar and his left shoulder as well. Now onto that conundrum or the obstacle of this being a black and white photograph. So someone interestingly enough told me recently that you can colorize your photos in Photoshop. I was excited. I wanted to see what this thing's able to do. I have something called Photoshop Elements. I'm not even sure if that's the full version or not, but needless to say, I wasn't too excited about the results. It just sort of makes it look like it's an old photo or a sepia photo, or gives it this bluish tint and basically renders it useless. So I was back to square one as to how to approach coloring his face for this portrait, basically using the exact same color principles that I've discussed in some of the previous portraits I've done here on YouTube, where, as I said, the light's coming in from his right. I've chosen to have it be cool light just by decision. So decision is cool light coming in from his right will render his shadows on his face, which I am working on right now, will render those shadows very warm. Even though some of these light parts of his face are applied, these cool lights are applied very whimsically, keeping of course in mind the drawing, but not being constrained by the drawing, if that makes any sense. Even though they're being applied like that, you can see in the finished work, a lot of it is cleaned up, not all of it, but this approach to painting, the style that I like to employ is, you keep it as loose as possible, as broken, quote unquote, as possible, and then you clean it up. I mean, it's not always just a two-step process. Sometimes this construction and deconstruction process can take any number of times throughout a portrait painting. As an example, you could go in there, you can render an eye and be happy with it, and then not be scared to sort of remove it, or certainly parts of it, and then reconstruct it again. And through this process of giving and taking, you create this spontaneous sort of final look. Now you see, with the base cool of his face being applied and the base warm of his shadows being applied, I'm coming in with this squeegee brush tool that everyone here that follows me is very familiar with. We used in this video the larger version of this brush. I've got them in 3 or 4 different sizes, 3 or 4 different sizes for this handheld variety. I've got squeegee tools, the hand ones, the silicone tools in other sizes as well. But what this tool allows you to do is apply these individual sort of notes of color that I call them, individual cues of color values that are very clean, very crisp, to define a form. Now, as I said, we're working on the light side, the cool side of his face. I'm applying all sorts of different varieties of cools, and not just the family that you would normally associate with cools, like blues, grays, blacks, or even greens. There's some purples in there. There's even slight tinges of reds. Cool reds, however, not any reds. So for the reds, you might be inclined to use alizarin crimson, for example, or a magenta, because they tend to lean more in the cool family. They're categorized as bluish reds. But all sorts of different colors are applied within the same value scale. So you got to be mindful of the color values you're applying if you intend to approach painting like I'm doing here. Now what I'm doing here is I'm knocking back some of those edges. By default, silicone brushes have a tendency to create hard edges. So I said initially that I was going to do more brushwork for this portrait, and it's more indicative of how I usually work. I do apply these cues of color often because they create interest that I really am after, but often also I will come in and knock back some of those edges and then go over on top of them. Again, through this process of construction and deconstruction, I'll go over on top of them with additional strokes, as I am doing right there, of silicone or brush for that matter. I want you to pay attention to the quality of my brushes. This one is particularly frayed. I don't know how long I've had it, but I find that to be the case more often than not. Most of my brushes are in all sorts of different shapes, but I find the most interesting marks are made with these guys that are just frayed, and they follow the form but sometimes surprise you with the kind of marks that they leave. So my advice is don't throw away your old frayed brushes. I want to mention just briefly on the notion of drawing. If you recall from the initial sketch there, I transferred the drawing onto the substrate. I didn't draw it in simply because, well, I don't know if I've discussed this previously on this channel. A lot of times what I do is I transfer a drawing over or project it onto my substrate for a couple different reasons. Of course, expediency, but also positioning on the actual substrate where I want him, what size I want him, and so on and so forth. I, of course, a lot of times, most times, I draw it in regardless, measuring and all those things. But the reason I mention this here is that even though I've kind of followed the drawing and defined it with a dry brush subsequently, a lot of the drawing gets lost. So as you can see me now working on that left eye, his right eye, it's nowhere near where it should be. So what I'm saying is each of the strokes that I'm applying with the silicone brush and this now frayed brush that I mentioned is mindful of a couple different things. What kind of strokes I'm applying, what kind of edge it's leaving, and defining the features of his face, because as I said, we're trying to get a likeness as close as possible and at the same time making it interesting looking. So there's that balance that's really a question mark as to how we get there. And if you recall from previous portraits, it's a process that you just have to accept and enjoy and hope that the end result sort of meets your expectations. I've been wanting to paint Nikola Tesla for some time, not least of which that we share the same ethnic background. He was born in a small town, small village in Croatia, and I grew up and was born in a small town about 100 kilometers away. from there. So there's a certain connection, of course, but for all of you that don't know who he was or the legacy that he left, I figured it's fitting that I at least address part of his history and who he was and what he stood for. I am by no means an expert. I've read one book on him, and in fact, frankly, I'm just going to read certain bullet points off this website just so I don't forget anything. He was, as I said, born in then Austrian Empire in 1856, and of course, just like everyone else, the genius that he was, he showed early talents for mathematics and engineering. After completing studies at the Austrian Polytechnic in Graz, he worked for various electrical companies in Europe. This would have been mid to late 1800s, developing ideas for the induction motor and the alternating current. So this is probably the number one reason, or the thing that he's most known for. He played a key role in the so-called war of currents, leading to alternating current becoming the standard for electrical power. He collaborated with various other luminaries at that time, worked with Edison, clashed with him, left Edison's company, partnered with George Westinghouse, who backed Tesla's AC system. He continued later inventing various things, even conducted early experiments in wireless communication. This is well before Marconi. At the peak of his innovations, this would have been late 19th century, he built one of the first hydroelectric power plants in Niagara Falls, not too far from where I live now, and of course invented the Tesla coil, the famous Tesla coil, which essentially is a high voltage electrical transformer, and it produces high frequency alternating current that generates powerful electrical discharges like a lightning type spark. He unfortunately died alone and desolate in a New York hotel room in 1943, but was widely recognized as a pioneer of electrical, radio, and wireless technology. Certainly someone well ahead of his time. Checking in on the progress of this portrait, we've got this extreme close-up. I sometimes wonder if this camera of mine, which is not new, but it was pricey when I bought it, has this 4K lens on it. It sort of renders some of these details even more detailed than it is in real life. But nonetheless, it kind of delivers the message of, what this silicone brush, and if you use your regular brushes and clean them regular, is able to do. These notes of color, individual notes of color that I put down are quite evident in this close-up. As I said, it imparts options for you. So a lot of the portraits I've done here for YouTube and that I do on my own time previously have these notes of color, and I leave them just as such because they are textural. They are impasto strokes. So each one of them has a certain weight and presence. But in a minute here, what I'll do, and I didn't do this with my previous portraits here on YouTube, unlock them back just like I did earlier using a fan brush. So these notes of color follow, as I said, they adhere to this warm light, cool shadow principles. You can see there that I'm applying some warm blues in the shadow, even though, blues are categorized as cool. Here I've got like a cyan or a cerulean blue that's been slightly warmed even more in the shadows to add intrigue. And now that process I was just mentioning, I've got the cues there, but some of them are maybe too prominent and too thick, so I'm knocking them back and at the same time adding interest with some of the brush mark. As I said, and as you can see there, I'm using a fan brush for a reason, because fan brush doesn't muddy up those cues of color. It just sort of knocks them back. Now from that completed or semi-completed face on to his body or in his arm, you've got sort of two sides of this work. One is totally done, one is just getting started. You can see the underpainting, the acrylic underpainting yellow that sort of shimmers underneath that initial drawing on his clothes with the greens and black. I'm putting in the same sort of approach that I did to his face on his arm here. This arm ended up being more of a challenge than I anticipated. Even though I'm sort of copying my own arm here or my own hand, I don't know, it was just fighting me. It wasn't working. It was too big, too small. I had to work on it for quite some time. But because I had the colors already mixed up on my palette, you can see it there, I wanted to make sure that I was playing off of his face and applying similar values to his hand, but not as prominent, because I want that face to stick out. As I do his shirt, okay, so on here I've put out a few videos on the concept of design and note 10. If you haven't had a chance to look at it or watch them, I will link it down below. But this portrait starts off with that idea in mind. So the design and the composition of the portrait is probably the most important part of this. Now, of course, we're doing a likeness, so the drawing is probably just as important, but the composition and the way that I've placed him is, I think, just as important. So as a side note, if you haven't obviously watched those, or if you have, what I tend to do for composition or design, I group darks and lights together. So the painting, or in this case a portrait painting, needs to stand on its own as a black and white with regards to how appealing it looks, how appealing the shapes look, and so on, prior to you starting that painting. So in this case, the darks are his clothing, the bottom of the chair that he's sitting in, the fictitious chair that he's sitting in, because he's not sitting in a chair, it's me that's sitting in a chair, but also the other dark part, and it's the darkest part, is his hair and his I guess his eyes, and they stand out against that white background that we are yet to apply, that you can see there on the right. Because I've had some questions from previous videos on cold wax and oil, namely to do with the layering process, I thought I'd just sort of address some of them here. And what is the ideal wax to oil ratio for layering? So generally speaking, depending on the manufacturer, they say that you don't have to necessarily follow the fat over lean principles. Having said that, I mean, if you want to be safe, you can certainly go with using a thinner or transparent layer where you have 25% cold wax to 75% oil. Initially, you sort of scrape that in very, very thinly, and then go with a more moderate body with some transparency, meaning like 50 to 50 oil, and then a thicker top coat, which is more sculptural, that has more cold wax and less oil, just to be safe as a general rule. Now, that doesn't mean that I follow that. In fact, I have a tendency, like for this particular portrait, everything was close to 50-50 throughout. It was a one-day painting session, so alla prima. So and it dries relatively quickly, so I wasn't too concerned about cracking or any of those things. But if you're using cold wax over a multi-day session, you should be okay as well. If it is within one day's painting session, you can, as I said, you can go thin, mid-tone thicker, which is more wax, and then the thickest top coat can be 75% or more of wax to oil. And lastly, drying time and layering, they say day or two, but I've found that it becomes quite tacky. Even after you apply a thin coat, you can go ahead with the second coat to create those broken color effects that I talked about. As you can see there with that black, which is ivory black with slight warmth to it, I rarely use straight black. I do use black. I know it's a faux pas for some artists, but I'm using slight warmed black for his clothes with approximately, again, 50% cold wax to oil ratio. As I get ready to apply that background, I want you to take note of a couple of things. Firstly, I've broken my own rule. In one video, I've spoken a whole lot. I wasn't planning on doing that, but it's the inner teacher in me, I guess, who wants to share some of these concepts with you. But if you enjoy the lessons here, or you'd like to see something different, please let me know down below. I mean, as I said, this is relatively new to me. I'm not really technically polished. I have a lot of knowledge to share, but the angles, the camera, the lighting, me standing up, sitting down, fumbling around the tripod, all these things are a learning curve, if you will. You can see this application of a warm green yellow, I guess, for the background. It is very calculated, just like everything else, except, I guess, parts of his face. Everything is intuitive, calculated, not defined by lines or squares. As an example, you have a square, fill that in with a color. Everything is intuitive. Everything needs to breathe and communicate with one another. That's the case with this background. As you can see at the bottom right with the completed, it's there, it serves a role, but it cannot be overpowering, and it has in itself a story, and it has a lot of broken color. I want those underlying layers to sort of permeate through and communicate. And the look and feel of this, I don't know what you call it, like a distressed portrait, but yeah, this is indicative of my style, and I think it came together really well for this particular portrait. You'll also notice that some of the things are changed. You start off with an idea in mind, and a lot of things are retained, but for example, his right arm, I wanted to sort of put it in, or in that case would have been my right arm, but I got rid of it. It was just too much. It didn't need to be there. I totally darkened it, and as you can see there, I'm defining his left shoulder. I want that shoulder to lead to his face. I want that to be the crispest, sharpest line on the whole portrait, along with the collar, if you recall. And now adding interest with that squeegee, just like I often do, even at the end stage of painting, I use the squeegee or silicone just to sort of make it more distressed and add more interest. As we come in closer to the finished work, I want you to pay attention to all the little individual marks that we've made. The broken color, in some places you have the underlying underpainting, showing through the yellow, like under his arm there. Strokes are varied. There's a balance. There's direct application, there's streaks, there's hard edges, soft edges. Another drawback, by the way, of this camera of mine is it has a tendency to wash out these whites. Looking at them now, it just seems like they're all white, but in real life they are also very nuanced, just like his face there. As you come in closer, you can see all the little individual colors to define his face form. I was quite happy with the way that it came out and how realistic it actually is in real life, much more so, interestingly enough, than in this video. Thank you very much for watching all the way to the end. Next week, I don't know what I'm going to do yet, but I'm sure it's going to be intriguing, a combination of abstract and realism. For now, I will link a video from a few weeks back that deals with Note 10 that I mentioned. Thanks again, and happy painting.